Greetings. This PowerPoint presentation is on Leslie Feinberg's essay slash speech, I Can't Afford to Get Sick. Leslie Feinberg was born in 1949. Z died in 2014. This essay was published in Transliberation, a collection of essays that Z published in 1998. The speech was delivered at a National Transgender Health Conference. Feinberg is also well known for a few novels that Z wrote, including Stone Butch Blues, Here First novel from 1993, Transgender Warrior, it was published in 1996, is not a novel. Feinberg described herself as an anti-racist, white, working-class, secular Jewish, transgender, lesbian, female, revolutionary communist. A mouthful. And one thing I just want to point out here as we move forward is this issue of pronouns. You may have noticed that our editors to this PDF scan that I gave you, I circled it here on my edition, but uses the pronoun here and Z. And again, that was kind of a, I think our editor's choice to use that. Feinberg, and it's the one I'm using in this presentation here, just because it's the one that our editors chose. But I just want to explain real quick, in case that this pronoun is maybe new to some people. Feinberg actually commented on here preferred gender pronoun and had this to say. For me, pronouns are always placed within context. I am female-bodied. I am a butch lesbian, a transgender lesbian. Referring to me as she, her is appropriate, particularly in a non-trans setting, in which referring to me as he would appear to resolve the social contradiction between my birth sex and gender expression and render my transgender expression invisible. I like the gender-neutral pronoun Z here because it makes it impossible to hold on to gender, sex, sexuality assumptions about a person you're trying to meet or you've just met. And I want you to keep that particular sentence in mind here because, again, I think if this pronoun is new to you, you should try to practice using it because the whole point of it is to kind of get away from a binary where there are only two pronouns in a lot of times I think our culture reinforces this idea of a gender binary, that you can either be a he or you can be a she. But I think what this pronoun is deliberately trying to do is suggest that those aren't the only two options, right? And then the final thing Feinberg says here is, and in an all trans setting, referring to me as he, him honors my gender expression in the same way that referring to my sister drag queens as she, her does. So basically, I think what Feinberg is saying here is that here preferred pronoun really depends on who Z is with when Z is speaking or identifying herself. And in case this is a new concept to people, one thing I think is really helpful to keep in mind is this idea of the genderbread person, which is a helpful teaching tool for thinking about the kind of the difference between gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender expression. So what this kind of breaks down here is that gender identity is how you in your head think about yourself, right? So that's why this brain is highlighted. Gender expression is how you demonstrate your gender based on traditional gender roles through the ways you act, behave, dress, and interact. So that's kind of like, the way that your body appears to other people, the way that you make your body appear through the way that you dress. So it's kind of like the whole thing. Biological sex is the objectively measurable organs, hormones, and chromosomes. What genitalia you have is basically sex. And sexual orientation, of course, here is demonstrated as a spectrum, heterosexual being on one end, homosexual being on the other, but also recognizing that there are places in between those two, right? And I like this graph here because it kind of shows how all of these things are spectrums, right? Your gender identity, you can be masculine on the one hand, and feminine on the other, but there are a number of different kind of gender expressions within that, like genderqueer. And when Feinberg says that Z identifies as a butch lesbian, it means that here gender expression would be kind of more here on the masculine um, end of the spectrum, but that her here sexual orientation would be um, more here on the homosexual. Um, so a couple things I wanted to bring to your attention. First of all, thinking about the Z here pronoun. Um, Again, that might be new to some people. Um, and I think it's important to kind of keep in mind the justification that Feinberg gives for which pronouns he prefers in which context. But this particular speech, the text that I had you read, I can't afford to get sick. I think it's important to keep in mind who the audience is here, and I also think keeping the context in mind that when Feinberg delivered this speech, Z was so sick, Z almost couldn't do it, right? I felt so ill, the room seemed to spin. Yet if I stepped down from this podium, where would I go to seek health care? And Z explains that, um, Z felt sick as a dog, right? But also, Z defines who Z is speaking in front of. There were 350 people there. Some worked as AIDS service centers, at AIDS service centers. Others were healthcare providers. Some were gay, lesbian, and bi. Others were heterosexual. A few were trans. Some were assigned by their agencies to attend. Others came on their own accord. So, in other words, it is kind of a mixed audience, kind of politically. Like some people might be kind of begrudgingly be there begrudgingly, like they don't necessarily want to be here, but they have to because it's part of their job. And other people there might also be allied with what Z is saying here. Um, and to kind of break down the purpose a little bit, it seems like there's a threefold purpose to this speech. One is to um, share here experience as a working class trans patient in our healthcare system, and Z kind of records some rather alarming interactions that Z has had, like here on page 98. Z says, I felt vulnerable to potential hostility. I remember the resident who, while examining me for the strep throat, suddenly shoved his hands down my pants, shouting, "You're a freak." I remember the doctor who told me in a quiet voice that the devil, not Jesus, had encouraged me to choose the path I've walked in life. I remember every moment of humiliation I'd ever experienced at the hands of healthcare providers. Right? And then kind of goes on to explain how Z took that into account whenever Z had to go to the emergency room, or and also why Z avoided the emergency room until Z couldn't anymore. So yeah, I think if in one way this speech uh, maybe draws attention to the privilege you have if you have never had an uncomfortable um, experience in a healthcare setting, um, but also it just draws attention to the kind of the ignorance. And I mean, this is alarming to me because this is basically sexual assaults, right? Having somebody just stick their hands down your pants and say you're a freak, if they're analyzing you or examining you for strep throat, right? Why is that happening? And another thing Z is trying to do with this essay, I think, with this speech, is to try to acknowledge some of the problems within the healthcare system. Not only this kind of overwhelming ignorance by the caretakers that Z has encountered in her experience, But also like points to like there is kind of a labor issue here. Again, Z identifies as a communist, um, and has had a number of working class jobs throughout her life. So is willing to kind of identify, be in solidarity with healthcare workers on that point, that like sometimes if Z's waiting in a waiting room for hours and hours, that's because the system isn't working the way that it should, and the people are being overworked in a way that they shouldn't be. Um, Also, kind of comes up with this suggestion that, you know, because as a trans person, Leslie Feinberg was um, admitted to, kind of routinely admitted to wards based on biological sex, or what Z calls biological determinism, um, and kind of never felt comfortable in either the male ward or the female ward, right? Because that's not how Z identifies, right? And Z explains biological determinism here on 101. A weapon used for centuries to justify the oppression of women. Biological determinism only regards the sex we are assigned at birth as authentic. And then comes up with the proposal, well, why not admit patients to wards based on their ailment rather than their sex, right? Doesn't that make more sense? Um, and the third thing here is Z's advocating for change within the healthcare system, right? There should be mandatory sensitivity training for all healthcare workers and staff. And there should also be free healthcare for all. Again, this is if this is delivered in the 90s, this speech, it's obviously kind of pre-Affordable Care Act. And, you know, it's worth noting that that changes definitely have been made to the healthcare system since this was written. Um, and some of these concerns actually have been addressed. The healthcare staff maybe are more informed these days today, a few decades later. Um, Cooley Dickinson Hospital, for example, now has an LGBTQ care center where it's kind of putting issues of LGBTQ people in the foreground and kind of acknowledging them up front, so that they can have um, a good experience in the healthcare system. But that said, some of these issues are ongoing. Some of these things still need to be addressed. The Affordable Care Act, maybe it did grant healthcare to hundreds of thousands of people who never had access to it before, but we're kind of at a point now where we're wondering what the future of that is going to look like, right? Um, and one place in this text I just want to kind of focus your attention on for a minute. Um, in the past, when I've taught this essay, some students, particularly nursing students, kind of had this point in this part where she says, or where Z says, even well-intentioned healthcare providers can be hampered in their approach to trans patients based on what they've been taught is natural. A very caring nurse recently told me she wished trans people would inform her of that fact right away. If she finds out later, she feels duped, and she believes it's important for their health care, for their care, that she knows what their birth biology is. And Feinberg, her response to that is, to be blunt, it's really not her business. And, you know, I had students in the past kind of say to me that, well, if a trans patient is taking hormone therapy or something like that, it really is important to kind of inform a nurse of that up front. But I just want to temper this by saying that just because somebody identifies as trans doesn't necessarily mean that they're taking hormones. Um, so I think for Feinberg, there could still be an assumption being made here about like an assumption that again really is not the healthcare person's business. And this is also maybe why admittance forms should offer kind of a place to identify like a gender identity rather